The essay I'm about to read is called The 500 Block of Guilford Avenue, and it was the exact stretch of asphalt behind the Baltimore Sun where I worked from the time I was 19 until I was 41. And it begins with a quote from a great writer by the name of Roberto Bolaño. This is the equation: supply and demand and magic. When things come in pairs, there went in 2 and 2, reads Genesis. The existing order tends to hold. When the material world is divided by 3 and spliced back together like a coil of hawser on a steamship, it is then that something new is born. I have experienced this many, many times while casting about for the best way to coax a story from the other side of the veil. A short item in the newspaper: the death of Mattel Dawson, the Detroit forklift operator who gave away $1.3 million to charity, a few dollars at a time. That is mere fact, and though fascinating, is not enough. Add an anonymous snapshot found in a puddle, or the wisp of a lyric from Tin Pan Alley, and the unknown sits upright. But then, mix all of it with the mystery of a troubled young woman pushing through the revolving door of a downtown department store about to be demolished. Eureka. In my decades as a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, from the late 1970s through the second year of the 21st century, I was fascinated by the stretch of Guilford Avenue that runs behind the newspaper. Newsprint was once delivered there by rail car. The Jones Falls Expressway is busy overhead with traffic, either escaping or pouring into the city. And from the 5th floor newsroom, you could see the doghouse Wiener joint and the radiator silver pyramid atop the Maryland Penitentiary. When I walked out of the Sun for the last time in January of 2001, I took a knapsack full of reporters' notebooks, blank for future use. I'd long archived the ones used for obits and pierogi recipes, the books a severance check, and doubts about what I would do with stories that come at us every day, like the weather. I found myself on Guilford Avenue where the boys from the composing room drank beer after the final edition went to bed, where in 23 years I accumulated enough parking tickets to buy a used car, and where viewers of The Wire could watch a fictional city editor named Gus Haynes sitting on the newspaper's loading dock at the beginning of season 5. Gus Haynes, the patron saint of journalism, said Clark Johnson, the veteran actor who played the role. Gus Haynes, the perfect editor. And as perfect as Haynes may have been, it's unlikely that more than once he could have gotten away with running the stories that began to haunt me toward the end of my erratic run at 501 North Calvert Street. In 1993, I persuaded the Perspective editor to publish an All Souls Day essay cataloging prayers for the soul of Richard Manuel, pianist and founding member of the band, and a 1986 suicide. I prayed for Richard at various shrines and sanctuaries across the United States, and the story was called The Richard Manuel Indulgence Tour, and the managing editor, William Marimo, hated it. All of us are long gone from Calvert Street, but the story, like Manuel's fragile voice, endures, collected in an anthology of my newspaper work called Storyteller. 4 years later, I had less success persuading a feature editor to get behind a story not about prayers for the departed, but a visit from the dead. I wanted to write about 2 magical weeks in August when, all hopped up on heat and humidity, a stomach flu, a fever, and great popsicles, when from my sickbed I saw the specter of Anne Frank hovering near the ceiling of my Highlandtown row house. I've been reading about how the last person to report seeing Anne alive had described the young writer dying of typhus and naked beneath a filthy blanket, no tears left to cry. Not only did I see Anne's ghost beneath the blanket, but also for the rest of that year, by diminishing degrees, It felt as though she and I were the same person, and I was inclined to believe it. "I'd like to write about that," I told the editor, who looked at me sympathetically, pursed her lips, paid for our lunch at the now-defunct Calvert House, and never again asked if I had any ideas up my sleeve. Roberto Bolano, who chose work as a night watchman at Spanish campground over any job that might bleed his pen dry, would have run that story. In my 2 decades as a reporter, I filed millions of words of copy. I wrote about the weather, too hot, too cold, deluge and drought, all manner of violence, both depraved and stupid, recaps of boring speeches, once sitting through the blowhards Farrakhan and Sharpton in the same week, which sealed my decision to leave the paper, and tedious late-night meetings about sewer systems, school subsidies, Social Security. Though these pieces afforded the rare winning quote, like the guy who told me it was so hot the chickens were standing in line to be plucked, my interest increasingly wandered toward the mysticism that seemed to be in concert with so much local suffering. And Guilford Avenue, a bit of a Hooverville since the days of Reagan, was always fertile ground. At the end of the summer of 1994, after returning to Baltimore from a month-long road trip with my youngest child, Sophia, I drove directly to the newspaper to bang out stories about our adventures. I had just driven 2,000 miles, Baltimore to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Champaign, to Nashville, to Atlanta for a stroll through the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, to Orlando, and back to Baltimore. But the defining moment of that trip occurred the day I got back home. The summer of 1994 was not an easy one. Sophia's mother and I, divorced for 5 years, had been dating to see if the family might live together again. The kids were not aware of these outings. A movie, coffee, and pie. We would go to see the band that year without Richard Manuel, already dead. These were more like excuses to re-break bones that had not set properly than nights on the town. And in the end, it was clear there would be reconciliation but not reunion. But none of this was clear when I drove to the Sun after 4 weeks on the road. It was raining hard as I drove past the corner of Madison Street and Guilford Avenue. Noah and the Ark, Cats and Dogs, Morton Salt Kid without her umbrella, Little Bobby Zimmerman, A Hard Rain is Going to Fall Hard. At times I couldn't see through the windshield, but the highway above Guilford Avenue provided temporary relief as I idled at a red light a block from the paper. It was just about midnight, and I had an ex-wife on my mind when I happened to glimpse an especially Baltimorean version of the American Gothic. At my left, perhaps trying to flag a cab in a town where taxis are hard to come by in good weather, I saw this lineup standing in the downpour. A tall transvestite, a teenager dressed in the uncompromising uniform of the corner, and a young woman holding a baby that looked like it had been born that morning. The baby clinched it. Crap, what's a Catholic boy to do? I rolled down the window, rain on my face, and asked where they were going. The guy in drag said that some of them were headed this way and some of them were headed one way, and forcefully I just said, "Where do you want to go?" The mother handed the infant to the transvestite, who began walking in the direction of the penitentiary with the corner boy, and Mom hops in the car and tells me to take her to a public housing in a far South Baltimore neighborhood called Cherry Hill. Get this straight. The transvestite walks into the teeth of a monsoon with the newborn under his jacket while the kid's mother grabs a ride home. I filed dispatches from around the world, yet this vignette proved again that Baltimore is the only dot on the map where I care to write stories. This is quantum narrative, supply and demand and magic, and it had somehow held sway with enough stagecraft this rainy night for me to tell my ex-wife the very next morning that our exploratory surgery was over. This is a story I didn't even try to interest the newspaper in running. Thank you.